When they mocked my gift, I didn't argue it was their father's last wish. The Christmas wrapping paper lay scattered across my stepmother's pristine living room, like confetti after a celebration that had turned sour. 27 family members sat in their designated spots, the same arrangement we'd maintained for the past 15 years since Dad married Victoria, each person occupying their place in the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of his blended family. I held the wooden box in my lap, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, the brass hinges tarnished with age. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay Dad's old pocket watch, the one his grandfather had given him when he turned 18, the one he'd carried through his first job, his first marriage, his divorce, his second marriage, and every important moment of his 73 years. Seriously, my half-brother Derek laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive in the sudden quiet. A broken old watch. That's what Dad left you. It's not broken, I said quietly, running my thumb over the engraved initials on the case. It just needs to be wound. Same difference, Victoria said, from her throne-like armchair, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescension she'd perfected over the years. I can't imagine why Harold would leave you something so, impractical. My half-sister Amanda leaned forward, her designer jewelry catching the light from the Christmas tree. I mean, what are you supposed to do with it? It's not like you can even sell it for anything meaningful. The words stung, but not for the reasons they intended. They thought this was about money, about the value of inheritance, about who got what from Dad's estate. They had no idea what this watch actually represented, what Dad had told me about it during our last conversation in the hospital, what promise I'd made to him in those final, precious moments. It's a beautiful piece, my stepbrother Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was merely being polite. Very, vintage. I'm sure it has sentimental value. Sentimental value. As if sentiment was somehow lesser than the stock portfolios and real estate holdings that had been distributed among the rest of them. As if the stories contained within this small metal circle were worth less than the numbers in their bank accounts. Dad always said time was the most valuable thing we have, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He said this watch had seen more life than most people ever would. Derek snorted. Dad said a lot of things. Doesn't mean they made sense. Derek, Victoria warned, but her tone was more about maintaining appearances than genuine reproach. Let's not speak ill of the dead. I'm not speaking ill, I'm just saying Dad got sentimental in his old age. Started talking about legacy and meaning and all that philosophical stuff. Derek gestured dismissively at the watch. Meanwhile, the rest of us got actual assets. Things we can use. Like your new BMW, I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Like investments that will appreciate in value, Amanda corrected. Like property that will provide security for our children, like practical gifts from a practical man. But Dad hadn't been practical in the end. In those final weeks, as the cancer ate away at his body, he'd become something else entirely, reflective, urgent, desperate to make sure his real legacy was understood and preserved. The man who had built a fortune through careful calculation and strategic thinking had spent his last days talking about love and time and the things that couldn't be measured in dollars. You know what I think? Derek said, settling back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver a killing blow. I think Dad felt guilty. About the divorce, about not being around when you were growing up, about choosing his new family over his old one. So he gave you the watch as some kind of consolation prize. Derek, that's enough, Marcus said. But his protest was half-hearted, is it? Because let's be honest here. Sarah gets a broken watch, and the rest of us get the house, the investments, the business interests. If that's not guilt talking, I don't know what is. The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of children playing in the next room. I could feel 27 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for my response, waiting to see if I would defend myself or break down or storm out in anger. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I carefully closed the watch box and held it against my chest. Feeling the weight of it, the solid reality of the last gift my father would ever give me. "You're right," I said finally. "This is about guilt." Derek's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He'd been expecting an argument, a defense, tears perhaps. He hadn't been expecting agreement. "Dad did feel guilty," I continued. "He told me so, in the hospital. He said he'd spent so many years focused on building wealth that he'd forgotten to build relationships. He said he'd been a better provider than he'd been a father." Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Harold was a wonderful father to all of you. He tried to be," I agreed, "but he was human. He made mistakes. He had regrets." I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. This watch isn't a consolation prize. It's not guilt money. It's something much more important than that. "What could be more important than financial security?" Amanda asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "A promise," I said simply. "A promise I made to Dad, and a promise he made to me." The words hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, heavy with implication. I could see the curiosity warring with skepticism on their faces. The desire to know more battling with their assumption that whatever I had to say couldn't possibly be as important as what they'd already received. "What kind of promise?" Marcus asked, his voice gentler than his siblings. I opened the watch box again and lifted out the timepiece, its weight familiar and comforting in my palm. "Dad asked me to keep this watch running, to wind it every day, to carry it with me, to make sure it never stopped ticking." "That's it?" Derek laughed. "That's the big promise. To wind an old watch." "That's not all," I said, my voice growing stronger. "He also asked me to tell you something, all of you, something he wanted you to know but couldn't figure out how to say while he was alive." The laughter died on Derek's lips. Victoria leaned forward in her chair, her carefully composed expression slipping slightly. Amanda and Marcus exchanged glances, and I could see the rest of the family straining to hear what would come next. "He wanted you to know that he loved you," I said. "All of you. But he also wanted you to know that love isn't measured in dollars or property or stock options. It's measured in time, in attention, in presence." "Sarah," Victoria said carefully, "I think you might be reading more into this than he kept a journal," I interrupted. "In his final weeks, he wrote about each of you, about his hopes for your futures, about the things he wished he'd said and done differently. He wrote about the watch, too, about what it meant to him and what he hoped it would mean to me." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "This is a letter he wrote to all of you. He asked me to read it today, after the gifts were opened, after you'd had time to see what he'd left behind." The room was completely silent now, even the children's voices from the next room seeming to fade into the background. I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking time with mechanical precision, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its presence. "Should I read it?" I asked, looking around the room. Victoria nodded slowly, her face pale above her elegant Christmas dress. "Yes, I think we need to hear what he had to say." I unfolded the letter carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I began to read my father's final words to his family. "My dear family," I began, my father's handwriting, shaky but determined across the page. "If Sarah is reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means you've all received your inheritances. I hope you understand that the material things I've left you are just that, things. What I really wanted to leave you was something more valuable, but I'm not sure I know how to give it." I paused, looking up to see tears already forming in Victoria's eyes. She'd been married to my father for 15 years, had seen him build his fortune and his second family. But she'd also seen him struggle with the weight of his choices in those final months. I spent most of my life believing that success was measured in dollars and achievements. I continued reading. I thought that if I could provide for my families, both of them, then I was doing my job as a husband and father. I thought that financial security was the same thing as love, that a full bank account could make up for an empty chair at the dinner table. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier smugness replaced by something more complex, more uncertain. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about time. I treated it like it was infinite, like there would always be more opportunities to say the things that mattered, to be present for the moments that counted. I scheduled my children like business meetings, thinking that quality time could be planned and optimized like a quarterly report. Amanda was crying now, her perfect makeup beginning to smudge. "Dad," she whispered, as if he could hear her. "The watch I've given to Sarah belonged to my grandfather, and his grandfather before him. It's been passed down through 4 generations of men who understood something I forgot for most of my life. That time is the only currency that really matters. You can't save it, you can't invest it, you can't get more of it once it's gone. You can only spend it, and the question is whether you spend it on the things that matter or waste it on the things that don't." I looked up from the letter to see Marcus wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Should I continue?" "Please," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave Sarah the watch not because she's more deserving than the rest of you, but because she's the one who understood this lesson before I did. When her mother and I divorced, when I started my new life with Victoria and had new children to raise, Sarah never stopped making time for me. She called every week, visited when she could, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, even when I forgot hers." The words hit the room like physical blows. I could see the guilt and recognition dawning on their faces as they remembered all the times they'd been too busy for Dad, all the calls that went unanswered, all the visits that were postponed for more convenient times. "She didn't do this because she expected anything in return," I continued. "She did it because she loved me, and because she understood that love is an action, not a feeling. Love is showing up. Love is being present. Love is making time for the people who matter, even when it's inconvenient." Derek was staring at his hands now, his face flushed with shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know he felt that way. The money I've left you will help secure your futures. I read on, but it won't make you happy. Happiness comes from relationships, from connection, from the time you spend with the people you love. The watch I've given Sarah is a reminder of this truth, but it's also a responsibility." I paused, feeling the weight of that responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle. "I've asked her to keep the watch running, to wind it every day, because I want her to remember that every tick represents a moment that will never come again. But I've also asked her to share this lesson with all of you, to help you understand what I learned too late. That the most valuable inheritance I can leave you isn't money or property, but the knowledge that time spent with family is the only investment that truly pays dividends." The room was completely silent now, except for the soft sounds of crying and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. I could feel the emotional weight of Dad's words settling over the family like snow, covering everything in a blanket of shared understanding and regret. "Victoria," I continued reading, "thank you for giving me 15 years of happiness and for raising our children with love and patience. I know I wasn't always present the way I should have been, but you made our house a home and our children into good people." Victoria was sobbing now, her composed facade completely shattered. "He never said things like that when he was alive," she managed through her tears. "Derek, Amanda, Marcus, I read, you are my pride and joy, but I fear I taught you to value the wrong things. I hope you'll learn from my mistakes and remember that success without love is just expensive failure. Make time for each other. Make time for your children. Make time for the moments that matter." Derek stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking. Amanda reached for Marcus's hand, and I could see them both struggling with the weight of Dad's words. "And Sarah," I continued, my voice breaking slightly, "my firstborn. My reminder of who I used to be before I got lost in the pursuit of success. Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what unconditional love looks like. The watch is yours, not because you need it, but because you already understand its lesson. Help the others learn what you've always known." I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking as I placed it back in my purse. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had greeted my gift. This was the silence of people processing truth, of hearts being broken open and reformed. "There's more," I said quietly. "Dad asked me to tell you about the last conversation we had, about what he said when he gave me the watch." Victoria looked up, her eyes red but hopeful. "What did he say?" "He said that he'd spent his whole life trying to give his children everything they needed to be successful, but he'd forgotten to give them the one thing they needed to be happy, which was," Marcus asked, "his time, his attention, his presence." I opened the watch box again and lifted out the timepiece, its gold surface catching the light from the Christmas tree. He said this watch had been present for every important moment in his life, and he wanted it to be present for every important moment in mine. But more than that, he wanted it to remind me, to remind all of us, that presence is the greatest gift we can give each other. I stood up, the watch warm in my palm, and walked to where Derek stood by the window. "He loved you," I said simply. "He was proud of you. He just didn't know how to show it in a way that mattered." Derek turned around, tears streaming down his face. "I was so angry with him," he said. "For so many years, I was angry that he seemed to care more about work than about us." "He did care more about work," I said gently. "That was his mistake. But he knew it was a mistake, and he spent his last weeks trying to figure out how to fix it." I walked to Amanda next, who was still crying silently in her chair. "He said you had his business sense, but your mother's heart. He said he hoped you'd use both to build something meaningful." "I don't know how," Amanda whispered. "Start with time," I said. "Start with being present for your children, the way he wished he'd been present for us." Finally, I approached Victoria, who was sitting very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "He said you saved him," I told her. "He said that loving you taught him what he'd been missing with my mother, what he'd been too young and too ambitious to understand the first time around." "Then why didn't he change?" she asked, her voice broken. "If he understood, why didn't he do things differently?" "Because change is hard," I said. "Because old habits die hard. Because he was afraid that if he slowed down, if he stopped working so much, everything he'd built would fall apart." I returned to my seat and carefully wound the watch, the familiar motion soothing in its simplicity. The soft ticking filled the room, marking time with patient persistence. "This is what Dad wanted," I said, holding up the watch so everyone could see its face. Not the watch itself, but what it represents. Time, attention, presence, the willingness to show up for each other, even when it's inconvenient, even when we're busy, even when we think there will always be tomorrow. The room was quiet except for the gentle ticking and the soft sounds of people trying to compose themselves. I could see them all processing Dad's words, weighing them against their own memories and regrets. "So what do we do now?" Marcus asked finally. "Now," I said, "we try to do better." The afternoon light was fading outside the tall windows of Victoria's living room, casting long shadows across the scattered wrapping paper and abandoned gift boxes. The family had settled into a different kind of quiet now, not the uncomfortable silence of earlier, but the contemplative hush of people grappling with profound truths they weren't sure how to handle. "I need to tell you all something," Victoria said suddenly, her voice still thick from crying, but stronger than it had been. "Something Harold made me promise to keep secret until after he was gone." All eyes turned to her, and I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in my chest. Dad had been full of secrets in his final weeks, full of confessions and revelations that he'd been too proud or too afraid to share while he was healthy. "The business," she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "The investments, the properties, Harold didn't leave them to you because he thought you deserved them more than Sarah. He left them to you because he was terrified that you wouldn't be able to take care of yourselves without them." Derek frowned. "What do you mean?" "He said that Sarah had learned to be independent, to work for what she wanted, to find meaning in things that couldn't be bought or sold. But he worried that the rest of you had become too dependent on his money, too comfortable with having everything provided for you." The words hit the room like a slap. I could see the shock and hurt on my half-siblings' faces. The way Victoria's revelation challenged their understanding of themselves and their relationship with their father, That's not true, Amanda protested. I work. We all work. You work in the family business, Victoria said gently. In positions Harold created for you, with salaries he set, in an environment where failure wasn't really possible because he was always there to catch you if you fell. So the inheritance was what? Some kind of test? Derek's voice was sharp with anger and hurt. Not a test, a safety net. He wanted to make sure you'd be financially secure even if you never learned to be emotionally secure. Victoria looked around the room, her eyes settling on each of her children in turn. But he also hoped that losing him would force you to grow in ways that his presence never allowed. I felt a deep sadness settling in my chest as I listened to Victoria's words. Dad had been trying to protect his children, but in doing so, he'd also limited them, created a kind of golden cage that kept them safe, but also kept them small. What about Sarah? Marcus asked. Why was she different? Because she had to be, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since reading the letter. When Mom and Dad divorced, when he started his new family, I had to learn to take care of myself. I had to learn that love wasn't the same thing as financial support, that I could survive without his money, but not without his attention. But you got his attention, Derek said, and I could hear the old resentment creeping back into his voice. You were the one he called, the one he visited with, the one he confided in. Because I made time for him, I said simply, because I showed up. Because I learned that relationships require effort from both sides. And I was willing to put in that effort even when it wasn't reciprocated. The truth of it hung in the air between us, uncomfortable but undeniable. I had worked for Dad's attention in a way that my half-siblings had never had to, and that work had created a different kind of relationship, one based on choice rather than obligation. I'm sorry, Amanda said suddenly, her voice small and broken. I'm sorry we mocked your gift. I'm sorry we didn't understand. I'm sorry too, Marcus added. For assuming that money was more important than meaning, Derek was still standing by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders rigid with tension. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. I don't know how to be the person Dad wanted me to be. You don't have to be anyone but yourself, I said, standing up and walking to where he stood. Dad didn't want you to change who you are. He just wanted you to understand what really matters. But I don't understand, Derek said, turning to face me. I don't understand how to value time over money, how to prioritize relationships over success. I've spent my whole life learning that achievement is what matters. That providing for your family is the highest form of love. Providing for your family is important, I agreed, but being present for your family is more important. Dad learned that too late, but you don't have to. I reached into my purse and pulled out something else Dad had given me, a small leather journal, worn smooth from years of use. He kept this for the last 6 months of his life. He wrote in it every day, documenting his thoughts and feelings and regrets. He asked me to share it with you when you were ready to hear it. Victoria's eyes widened. I never saw him writing in a journal. He wrote in it at the hospital during his treatments. He said it helped him process what he was going through, helped him figure out what he really wanted to say to all of you. I opened the journal to a page I'd marked with a bookmark, one of many entries where Dad had written about his children and his hopes for their futures. This is from 3 weeks before he died, I said, and began to read. Derek came to visit today, but he spent most of the time on his phone, dealing with some crisis at the office. I wanted to tell him that the crisis would resolve itself, that there would always be another crisis, but that this time we have together is finite and precious. I wanted to tell him that I'm proud of his work ethic, but I'm worried that he's inherited my worst traits along with my best ones. Derek's face crumpled, and I could see him struggling not to break down completely. Amanda brought the grandchildren. I continued reading. But she was so focused on keeping them quiet and well-behaved that she missed the joy of just watching them be children. I wanted to tell her that a little chaos is worth it if it means being present for the moments that matter. I wanted to tell her that she's a wonderful mother, but that she doesn't have to be a perfect one. Amanda was crying again, her hands pressed to her mouth as if she could hold back the sobs. Marcus asked about the business, about succession planning, about making sure everything would be handled properly after I'm gone. I appreciate his sense of responsibility, but I wanted to tell him that the business will survive without me, that what won't survive is the time we have left together. I wanted to tell him that he's already proven himself, that he doesn't need my approval anymore. Marcus was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched with emotion. Sarah just sat with me, I read, my voice breaking slightly. She didn't try to fix anything or solve anything or make anything better. She just sat with me and let me talk about whatever was on my mind. She understood that sometimes presence is more valuable than solutions, that sometimes love is just showing up and staying put. I closed the journal and looked around the room at these people who shared my father's blood but had lived such different lives from mine. He loved you all, I said. He was proud of you all, but he was also worried about you all, worried that he'd taught you to value the wrong things. So what do we do? Victoria asked. How do we honor his memory? How do we become the family he wanted us to be? I looked down at the watch in my hand, its steady ticking, a reminder of time passing, of moments that would never come again. We start by being present, I said. We start by making time for each other, not just when it's convenient or scheduled, but when it matters. We start by remembering that love is an action, not just a feeling. But how? Derek asked, his voice desperate. How do we change patterns that have been in place for decades? One moment at a time, I said. One conversation at a time. One choice at a time to prioritize people over profit, presence over productivity. I walked back to my seat and carefully placed the watch back in its box, but I didn't close the lid. Dad asked me to keep this watch running, to wind it every day as a reminder of what really matters. But he also asked me to share its lesson with all of you. I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. I can't wind this watch for all of us. Each of you has to decide for yourself whether you want to make time for what matters, whether you want to be present for the people you love. The room was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the watch, and the soft sounds of people trying to process everything they'd heard. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded me of the light in Dad's hospital room during our last conversation. I have an idea, Amanda said suddenly. What if we started having dinner together once a week? All of us, no phones, no work talk, just family time. I'd like that, Marcus said immediately. Me too, Victoria added. Derek was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I think Dad would have liked that too. It wasn't a complete transformation. It wasn't the magical healing that movies promised. But it was a beginning, a first step toward becoming the family Dad had hoped we could be. 3 hours later, the house had taken on the warm, lived-in feeling that comes after difficult conversations have been had and emotional walls have been lowered. The formal Christmas dinner had given way to something more intimate, leftover turkey sandwiches eaten in the kitchen. Children playing quietly in the living room, adults talking in the soft, careful voices of people learning to be vulnerable with each other. I found myself in Dad's old study, a room that Victoria had left largely unchanged since his death 6 months ago. His books still lined the shelves. His reading glasses still sat on the desk next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. His favorite coffee mug still held a place of honor on the windowsill. He used to sit in here for hours, Victoria said, appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, especially toward the end. He'd just sit in his chair and stare out the window, like he was trying to memorize the view. I accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. What do you think he was thinking about? You, mostly. All of you. He had this photo album that he'd flipped through, pictures from when Derek and Amanda and Marcus were little. Pictures from your childhood, pictures from family vacations and birthdays and graduations. He'd study them like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Victoria settled into the chair across from Dad's desk. Her elegant Christmas dress now wrinkled and her makeup long since cried away. She looked more human than I'd ever seen her, more real and accessible. I need to tell you something, she said, her voice hesitant. Something I should have said years ago. I waited, sensing that this was important, that whatever she was about to share would change something fundamental between us. "I was jealous of you," she said finally. "For years, I was jealous of the relationship you had with Harold, of the way he lit up when you called, of the way he talked about you when you weren't around." The admission hung between us, honest and painful and necessary. "I thought it was because you were his first child, his firstborn, the one who came before me and my children. I thought it was about biology, about blood being thicker than water." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But it wasn't about that at all, was it?" "No," I said gently. "It wasn't about that. It was about effort. It was about showing up. It was about making time for him even when it was inconvenient, even when you had every reason to be angry with him for choosing his new family over his old one." I set down my tea and leaned forward, wanting her to understand something that had taken me years to figure out myself. "Victoria, I wasn't a better daughter than your children. I was just a different kind of daughter. I had to work for Dad's attention in a way that Derek and Amanda and Marcus never did. And that work created a different dynamic between us." "But you could have walked away," she said. "After the divorce, after he remarried, after he started his new life, you could have written him off and been justified in doing so. Instead, you kept reaching out, kept trying, kept believing that the relationship was worth saving, because it was worth saving. Because he was worth saving." Even when he didn't know how to save himself, Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden where she and Emma had planted tomatoes just that morning. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally. "I don't know how to undo 15 years of taking Harold's attention for granted, of assuming that love was automatic rather than earned." "You don't have to fix anything," I said. "You just have to start. You just have to decide that from now on, you're going to show up differently." "How?" I thought about Dad's journal, about all the entries where he'd written about his regrets and his hopes for his family's future. "By being present. By putting down your phone when your children are talking to you. By asking them about their lives and actually listening to the answers. By making time for the moments that matter." It sounds so simple when you say it like that. It is simple. It's just not easy. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light of Christmas Day fade from the sky. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of the family in the other room, Derek helping his children with a new puzzle. Amanda reading a story to her youngest, Marcus and his wife discussing plans for the week ahead. "Sarah," Victoria said suddenly, "would you consider something?" "What?" "Would you consider keeping the watch here? Not giving it up, but keeping it here in Harold's study, where we could all see it, where it could remind all of us of what he wanted us to remember." The request surprised me. I'd been planning to take the watch home, to keep it on my nightstand, where I could wind it every morning as Dad had asked. But there was something appealing about Victoria's suggestion. Something that felt right about keeping Dad's most precious possession in the place where he'd spent his final months thinking about time and family and what really mattered. "I think Dad would like that," I said finally. "But I have a condition." "What?" "We all take turns winding it. Every week, a different person takes responsibility for keeping it running. That way, we're all invested in honoring Dad's memory, and we're all reminded of what the watch represents." Victoria's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "I love that idea. A shared responsibility, a shared reminder." And I continued, warming to the idea whoever winds the watch that week has to share a memory of Dad. Something specific, something that captures who he was or what he meant to them. That way, we keep his stories alive, along with his timepiece. "Yes," Victoria said, tears forming in her eyes again. "Yes, he would have loved that." I opened the watch box and lifted out the timepiece, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. "Should we start now? Should we establish the tradition tonight?" "I think we should." I stood up and walked to Dad's desk, clearing a space among his papers and books. I set the watch carefully in the center, where it could be seen from anywhere in the room, where its gentle ticking could fill the space with the sound of time passing, of moments being counted and cherished. "Dad," I said softly, speaking to the empty chair where he used to sit. I hope this is what you wanted. I hope this is how you imagined us honoring your memory. Victoria joined me at the desk, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. He's proud of you, she said. Wherever he is, whatever comes next. He's proud of the woman you've become and the family you're helping us become. The watch ticked steadily on the desk, marking time with patient persistence, indifferent to our human drama, but somehow central to it all the same. In its simple mechanical rhythm, I could hear the echo of Dad's final wish that his family would learn to value time over money, presence over productivity, love over achievement. We should go back to the others, I said finally. We should tell them about the plan, get them involved in creating this new tradition. In a minute, Victoria said, "First, I want to wind the watch. I want to be the first one to take responsibility for keeping Harold's memory alive." She picked up the timepiece with reverent hands, her fingers finding the winding mechanism with surprising ease. As she turned the small crown, I could hear the watch's internal springs tightening, storing energy that would keep it running for days to come. "There," she said, setting it back on the desk. "Now it's ready for whatever comes next." We stood there for a moment, listening to the steady tick-tick-tick that would become the heartbeat of our family's new beginning. Then, together, we walked back to the living room where the rest of the family was waiting, where the work of becoming better people would continue one moment, one choice, one act of presence at a time. 1 year later, I stood in the same study, watching my half-brother Derek carefully wind Dad's pocket watch as his 5-year-old daughter Emma looked on with wide, curious eyes. It was Derek's week to tend to the watch, and he'd brought Emma with him to learn about the tradition that had become the cornerstone of our family's new way of being together. "Why do we have to wind it, Daddy?" Emma asked, her small fingers tracing the edge of Dad's desk. "Because, sweetheart," Derek said, his voice gentle and patient in a way that would have surprised me a year ago. "This watch belonged to your grandfather, and he wanted us to remember that time is precious. Every time we wind it, we're promising to spend our time on the things that matter most, like family." Exactly like family. The transformation hadn't been instant or complete, but it had been real. The weekly family dinners that Amanda had suggested on Christmas Day had become sacred time, phone-free zones where we practiced the art of being present with each other. Derek had started leaving work at 5 o'clock to have dinner with his children. Amanda had begun taking her kids on weekend adventures without scheduling every moment. Marcus had learned to sit quietly with his aging mother-in-law instead of trying to fix her loneliness with solutions. And Victoria had become something I'd never expected, a friend. "Sarah," she said now, appearing in the doorway with her usual grace but also with a warmth that had developed over months of shared grief and growing understanding. "The others are here for dinner. Are you ready?" I nodded, taking one last look around the study that had become our family's shrine to Dad's memory. The walls were covered now with photos from our weekly dinners. Pictures that captured the slow evolution of our relationships, tentative smiles giving way to genuine laughter, formal poses relaxing into natural affection, separate individuals learning to become a cohesive family. The watch sat in its place of honor on Dad's desk. Surrounded by the weekly memory cards, we'd started writing small notes about moments we'd shared with him, lessons he'd taught us, ways he'd influenced our lives. The collection had grown thick over the months, a paper testament to a life that had been more meaningful than any of us had fully understood while he was alive. Derek's memory this week was beautiful, Victoria said as we walked toward the dining room. He talked about the time Harold taught him to ride a bike, how patient he was, how he ran alongside the bike for what felt like hours, until Derek felt confident enough to ride on his own. "I remember that day," I said. "I was visiting for the weekend, and Dad was so proud when Derek finally got it. He called Mom to tell her about it, wanted to share the victory even though they'd been divorced for years." "He was complicated," Victoria said, "but he loved deeply. We're all learning that love and presence aren't the same thing, but they can be when you work at it." The dining room was full when we arrived. 3 generations gathered around the table that had once been a battlefield of unspoken resentments and now served as neutral ground for the ongoing work of building authentic relationships. Derek's children were helping Amanda's kids set the table, their laughter mixing with the soft conversation of the adults. Marcus stood up when he saw me, pulling out my chair with a gallantry that had become one of his endearing habits. "How was your week?" he asked, and I could tell he genuinely wanted to know that this wasn't just polite conversation, but real interest in my life. "Good," I said, settling into my seat. "Busy at work, but good, busy. We're opening a new program for single mothers, and the response has been overwhelming." "That's wonderful," Amanda said, and I could see the pride in her eyes. Over the past year, she'd become one of my strongest supporters, often asking about my work and occasionally volunteering her business skills to help with fundraising events. "What about you?" I asked. "How did the presentation go?" Amanda's face lit up. "Really well, actually. The board approved the new family leave policy, and we're implementing it starting next month. Paid time off for new parents, flexible schedules for people with aging parents, mental health days, all the things that help people balance work and life. It was a small revolution, but a meaningful one." Amanda had used her position in the family business to advocate for policies that prioritized human needs over pure productivity. Changes that Dad would have resisted during his lifetime, but that honored the lessons he'd tried to teach us in his final months. "Dad would be proud," Derek said, echoing my thoughts. "He'd probably be confused by some of it, but he'd be proud. He'd be proud of all of us," Victoria said, raising her water glass in a toast. "For learning to be present with each other, for making time for what matters, for becoming the family he always hoped we could be." We raised our glasses in response, a ritual that had developed organically over the months of shared meals and shared memories. It wasn't about the alcohol or even the gesture itself, but about the moment of acknowledgement. The conscious choice to recognize our progress and our commitment to continuing the work. Dinner proceeded with the easy rhythm of people who had learned to enjoy each other's company. Conversations flowed naturally from work to family to current events, with everyone contributing and everyone listening. The children were included rather than merely tolerated, their perspectives valued, and their presence celebrated. After the meal, as we cleared the dishes and prepared dessert, Derek's daughter Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Aunt Sarah," she said, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months, "can you tell me about Grandpa Harold? I don't remember him very well." I knelt down to her level, this child who carried Dad's eyes and his stubborn chin, who would grow up knowing him only through the stories we told and the traditions we maintained. "What would you like to know about him? Was he nice?" I thought about the question, about the complexity of the man who had been my father, about the ways he'd failed and succeeded, about the legacy he'd left behind. "He was human," I said finally. "He made mistakes, but he also did wonderful things. He worked very hard to take care of his family, and he loved us very much, even when he didn't know how to show it." "Do you miss him?" "Every day. But I also feel like he's still with us in some ways, in the things he taught us and the traditions he started. Like the watch." "Like the watch?" Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness that children brought to important topics. "When I'm grown up, can I wind the watch too?" "Absolutely," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "When you're grown up, you'll be part of keeping Grandpa Harold's memory alive." Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the family had dispersed to their respective homes, I found myself back in Dad's study with Victoria. It had become our tradition to end these family gatherings with a few minutes of quiet reflection, a chance to process the evening and plan for the week ahead. "Emma asked about Dad tonight," I said, settling into the chair that had become mine over the months of these conversations. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That he was complicated, that he loved us, that he's still with us in the things he taught us." Victoria nodded, her eyes fixed on the watch that continued its patient ticking on Dad's desk. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what we pass down to the next generation, about what kind of legacy we're creating." And what have you concluded? That Dad's greatest gift wasn't the money he left us, or even the watch he gave you. It was the crisis he created by dying, the way his death forced us to examine our relationships and our priorities. It was a profound observation, one that captured something essential about the year we'd all experienced. Dad's death had been devastating, but it had also been transformative, stripping away the pretenses and assumptions that had kept us from really knowing each other. He would have hated that, I said, smiling at the irony. He spent his whole life trying to avoid creating problems for his family, and his greatest contribution was the problem his death created. Maybe that's what love really is, Victoria said. Not the absence of problems, but the willingness to work through problems together. I looked around the study at the photos and memory cards and small mementos that had accumulated over the months, at the physical evidence of a family learning to honor its past while building its future. I think Dad would be surprised by how this all turned out, I said. I think he'd be amazed that his death brought us together instead of driving us apart. I think he'd be proud, Victoria said. I think he'd be proud that we learned his lesson, even if we learned it the hard way. The watch continued its steady ticking, marking time with mechanical precision. Indifferent to our human struggles, but somehow central to our human growth. In its simple, persistent rhythm, I could hear the echo of Dad's final wish that his family would learn to value time over money, presence over productivity, love over achievement. We had learned that lesson slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. We had become the family Dad had always hoped we could be, not despite his death, but because of it. Not in spite of our differences, but through the patient work of understanding them. The watch would continue ticking long after we were gone, passed down to Emma and her cousins and their children after them. But more important than the timepiece itself was the tradition it represented, the commitment to presence and attention and love that it symbolized. Dad's last wish had been fulfilled. Not through the gift itself, but through our willingness to understand what the gift meant. Time was indeed the most valuable thing we had, and we had finally learned how to spend it wisely. In the gentle ticking of an old pocket watch, a family had found its way home to each other, one moment at a time.